Welcome to another episode of Chad's Chat. Join Chad Chilius and me, Dax Castro, where each week we wax poetic about document accessibility topics, tips, and the struggle of remediation and compliance. So sit back, grab your favorite mug of whatever, and let's get started.
Welcome, everyone. Today's podcast is sponsored by the North Idaho College and their upcoming Pave the Way to Global Accessibility Awareness Day, or PWGAD, which is in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. PWGAD is on April 19th, 2023, and more information can be found at nic.edu/PWGAAD. So we want to thank them for being our sponsor for today's podcast. My name is Chad Chilius. I'm an Adobe certified instructor, as well as director of training solutions and principal at Chax Training and Consulting.
And my name is Dax Castro. I am director of media productions here at Chax Training Consulting. And Chad and I are both accessible document specialists. And if you want your accessible document specialist certification, head on over to accessibilityassociation.org/certifications. Hey, Chad, today I want to give a shout out to us, actually. This last week, we hit a milestone. 25,000 podcast downloads. That's pretty awesome.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And we did that in, I think, a little less than 2 years. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, we're on season 3 right now.
Oh, we are. We are. Yeah.
So probably would have been 3, but still, either way, 25,000 times people listen to our podcast, which I am just amazed to hear. In fact, we posted this on a few different places, and one of the comments from one of our listeners says, "My coworkers think I'm a nerd because I listen to your podcast every time I commute to the office. 4 hours a week of driving equals 4 hours of Chax Chat. Ha ha. I even bought myself a little voice recorder so I could easily record snippets that I want to write down in my notebook when I get to the office. Safety first, right? And yes, I listen to every podcast through twice at least. Thanks, guys, for making my commute more enjoyable."
Interesting.
Julie.
Very interesting.
I was like blown away and so happy to know that we have at least one listener, but apparently we have 25,000 times people have listened. I'd love it if we had 25,000 listeners, but we'll get there.
Yeah. For sure.
Yep.
And I think that's a really creative idea because I'm guilty of that too, Dax. You know what I mean? Like, you know, you're listening to something in the car or even like reading something. And then like the next day I'm like, oh man, I read something really cool. What was that? You know?
Yeah.
And having a voice recorder is a great way of just like quickly recording your thoughts and then you could go back and reference it later. So I'm glad she's utilizing that. That's great.
Yes, absolutely. We are excited. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to last week's podcast about PWGAAD or PWGAD, definitely go take a listen. Having Jeremy Seta and Jacqueline on the podcast was great. We definitely had a lot of fun, and it was some good information about not only the event, but also about the struggles of having an accessibility program within your higher ed facility.
Yeah.
So definitely go take a look.
And there are struggles, right? I mean, you know, we've been open about this, right? And it's part of the reason why we do what we do is try to help people through those struggles. But I think it's pretty natural for companies to encounter this, right? You know what I mean? I think there's it's typical to have hesitation. Yep. Especially when there's a cost involved, right? And I think
change is always hard, right?
I
mean, you do things the way you're always doing them, and somebody taps you on the shoulder and says you've got to completely change how you're doing things, or you've been doing it wrong all this time, which is usually less well received. Yeah. But you know, it's and Jeremy talks about the carrot and the stick method and kind of what his approach was. So definitely go listen.
Listen to that because he's kind of a classic example. I mean, Jeremy's in higher ed and he's gone through this process, and I think he has a great kind of a great analogy as to how he approached it and how he got through it. So I think everybody would enjoy hearing that.
Yep. Speaking of things and helping people out, there was a new announcement today, Chad, that I'm pretty excited about. It is that the PDF standard for the ISO 32000-2, which is PDF 2, is available now for free. It used to have a cost, and now PDF Association is hosting it on their website for free.
Well, and Dax, this is kind of a big deal, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
Because I think we've talked about this on the podcast. I know you and I have talked about it before. And one of the challenges with PDF UA has always been that it's always been a pay to play proposition, right? You know, where with WCAG, all of the information is out there for the taking. Right. Yep. You want to know about info and relationships. You want to know about minimum color contrast. It's right there online for the taking. PDF UA, you used to have to spend a pretty penny,
couple $100.
Yeah. To get the guidance. And you and I also had talked about, Dax, about the fact that no country has adopted PDF UA as its standard.
Well, and that's not to say that you, right. And that's not to say that you shouldn't, but it's really hard to make a case for follow these rules. But, if you want to know how to follow these rules, you have to pay to get the standard.
Right.
And so I think this is a really good step for the ISO, for the PDF Association, to actually offer this for free. Because if you ever want people to adopt something, making it free is a really good first step. And so in today's episode, we want you to go to pdfa.org/sponsored-standards and download the standard, because we're going to walk you through about 8 or 10 places you really want to pay attention to. Guys, this is a behemoth. It is 1,003 pages. You do not want to start this from beginning to end. It's not designed that way. In fact, there's only one chapter, chapter 14, that you really need to really concentrate on. So right now, go to that website, pdfa.org/sponsored-standards, and hit the download the ISO 32000 bundle now. And when you do that, it will take you to a form. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you see 3 check boxes. Just check the first one. The other 2 are for digital signatures and hash algorithms. You don't need those if you're a remediator. Check the box and hit add to cart. And then it's going to take you to your shopping cart, and just hit proceed to check out. And it'll ask you for some information and place order, and then you can download the document. So go ahead and do that. Pause it right now. Go take care of that, and we'll check you back here in just a second. And now, by the magic of the powers of internet podcasts, we are back. Hopefully you've had a chance to go download it. If you're driving, hopefully you did not go download that. And you'll listen to this later on. But for sure, we want to have you open the document. Like I said, there's 1,003 pages. The first thing we want you to understand is that this is not meant to be read from beginning to end. The first 13 chapters are really about coding PDFs. It is not about remediation. This is like, I'm going to code something from scratch that needs to operate like a PDF. This is how you do it. So chapter 14 is really the place that you want to stay, right? It is going to be your home. Now, I want you to know, the first question I want to answer is, what is this document and why do I need it? When you get an error that says invalid MCID or improper use of some kind of thing, and you want to look up, what does that really mean? Or what is that, right? BBox error. That's one we get all the time. What is a BBox? And why is there an error, right? This document will give you the definitions and background behind a lot of things. And we're going to cover about 8 or 10 things that you really want to know. But know that this isn't everything. We're actually going to probably do this in a couple of different podcasts because there's just so much to cover. Right, Chad?
Yep, absolutely. For example, right, I could tell you, like, as I'm remediating files, one of the things that always pops up in the pack checker is an issue with the MCID, right? And, you're always kind of like, okay, whatever, just show me how to fix it, right? How do I get rid of this error? Right. And on page 746, it's actually in table 357, it tells us what the MCID is. And it's an element that is required, and it's basically the marked content identifier of the marked content sequence within its content stream. Now, I know you're probably thinking, I now know less about the MCID than I did before, but, it's at least good to be able to kind of, look at these definitions and get an idea of what, what these errors are or what these elements, what their purpose is for.
Well, and to just peel back the onion a bit here on the MCID, what this is basically saying is every object has a sequence in the stream of content. And the ID, the marked content identifier, is a number given to that object. It's not the tags tree. This is beyond the tags tree. And so when you merge two different documents, Acrobat's supposed to be smart enough to then reassign MCID 2 in document 1 and MCID 2 in document 2 to a new stream, a new content order. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. And you get duplicate MCID, or MCID already exists, right? MCID 37 already exists. And then you got to go to try to find 37, which can be a really big pain. So tools like Access PDF allow you to just rebuild the structural parent key tree, which then basically reassigns new MCIDs to everything and fixes that error. But if you have to do it by hand, it's a painstaking process, right?
It's brutal. And I can tell you, I mean, that particular situation, it often happens when you merge more than one PDF into one.
Right.
That's a very common task that causes that particular error.
So on page 761, it also talks about in section 14.8.2.2, right? Real content and artifacts. So this talks about what real content is. It says the real content of a document comprises graphic objects, annotations, and form fields representing material intentionally introduced by the document's author and necessary to understand the content of the document. And then then for artifacts, it says all other content is considered to be artifacts, whether generated by the PDF writer in the course of pagination, layout, or other mechanical processes, or introduced by the document author for decoration or other purposes that are not relevant to understanding the content of the document. So basically, meaningful, necessary information is real content, and everything else is artifacts. So this gives you a really good understanding of what these things are. And then it gives you a few different examples, and there's some notes and some other things. So definitely worth going and reading.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so another item that I really was happy to see, and again, it's just great to get some of your questions answered, because another common error that I know a lot of our listeners have seen is that dreaded BBox error.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And I Dax, I think you and I had a talk about this early on in our relationship, and I said to you, I'm like, if we're creating documents for, non-sighted users, visually impaired users, mobility impaired, what does it care where the object is on the page, right? Because sure. I couldn't quite process this, right? I mean, yep. It's a user of assistive technology. The screen reader is not telling me where it is on the page. Why does it care, right? And I think you kind of explained to me that it's important that the location of the graphic, or whatever the element is, chart, graphic, whatever, it's important that it knows where exactly it is on the page, potentially for use in a reflow situation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly correct. Because if it knows it's way over on the right when it's not in reflow, it needs to move it however many pixels left and however many pixels up or down when it does a reflow, right? And there are other technologies like liquid mode inside your mobile phone that needs to know where it is so that it can move it or resize it to handle your screen, right? So BBox. So tell us what the BBox is, Chad. What does it say?
So the BBox, and those of us who are graphic designers are very familiar with a BBox. We would typically refer to it as a bounding box, right? And when you're working in Illustrator or InDesign or even Photoshop, a lot of times you're working with a bounding box around an object that you're manipulating. But when it comes to PDF UA, the BBox is an array of 4 numbers in the user space, giving the coordinates of the I'm gonna paraphrase here: top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right corners of the object. And based on those parameters, it knows the size, the location, everything about where that object is located. That would have been, when you mentioned liquid mode, that would have been a great Leonard Rosenthal question. Yes. I would love to hear him like, hey, Leonard, are you using the BBox in liquid mode? I'd love to know what he says about that.
Well, and for our listeners, if you haven't heard that podcast, we did one last year with Leonard Rosenthal from Adobe. He came on and we talked about liquid mode in Adobe Acrobat for mobile. And that's a great podcast to go look for on our wherever we're streaming, on whatever podcast service you are. Just look for Rosenthal. It's pretty easy. Matter of fact, even if you Google Chax Rosenthal, our podcast comes up. That episode does come up, right? And the way you fix a BBox error is, if you delete the object from the tags tree, open up your read order tool and tag it again, most of the time it does fix it. There are times where it doesn't, and I've had to manually create the BBox coordinates. Not for the faint of heart. Not an easy process.
That's one thing I'll say. Like, you and I are big fans of Access PDF, and when you got a BBox error, Access PDF, it's literally a one button click.
Well, and what's even
resolves it.
and in Common Look, when you run the Common Look checker, it gives you the warning and says, "Hey, you have a BBox error. You just check the box that says fix this, not only for this one, but every other instance." Yeah. And instead of having to go one at a time and fix those BBoxes, you just check it and hit fix all, and it fixes it throughout the document, which is super sweet.
All this to say, guys, third-party tools are awesome.
Right. And this is not because we're trying to pimp out these tools. Literally, we have spent our time in the trenches fixing crap by hand. The tools just make life so much easier, right? Yeah. So another thing to talk about here is visible or invisible content. Now, or hidden or invisible content. Right now, some people, and I want you all to listen to me right now. I want you to bookmark this part of the podcast. I don't know what minutes or seconds we are because I'll edit it later. But if someone ever tells you you can't hide other content behind an image to describe the image or give a better user experience, you tell them, go look at the ISO-32000 standard at section 14.8.2.4, hidden or invisible page content. Because in here, so it says, for a variety of reasons, elements of a document's real content can be invisible on the page. They can be clipped, their color can match the background, or they can be obscured by other overlapping objects. For the purpose of a tag PDF, page content shall be considered to include all graphic objects in their entirety, regardless of whether they are visible when the document is displayed or printed. For example, invisible elements that can become visible when content is repurposed or a text-to-speech engine could speak the invisible text. So right here, it defends the idea that you could put a bulleted list for a org chart behind the visual org chart. And that's a valid approach. Yep. Just the other day, someone wanted to argue with me until forever about how I was absolutely wrong and that you absolutely can never hide things behind other things because it creates a cognitive barrier. But I will say, I do agree that it can be a cognitive barrier when somebody's trying to look at this from a coordination standpoint. But it is absolutely doable, and it's not a violation of not only, of the ISO standard, but it's also not a violation of WCAG, right? Some people want to cite info and relationships. Some people want to cite other things. But the bottom line is you absolutely can hide stuff behind other stuff to make a better user experience. And here's an example of it. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Well, you and I do that quite a bit, right? Yeah. I mean, it's a solution that I leverage on a regular basis because there's often situations I know, in the one document you and I were recently looking at where a person was a member of two groups in the document. Well, that content only exists one place.
Right.
And so how do you make that one thing a member of two things? You can't.
No.
And so one way of overcoming that limitation, and I want to be very clear here. I mean, people could poo-poo PDF all they want, but the ability to do that is something you cannot do in HTML.
Right.
I could not fix that problem in HTML because content is content, where in a PDF, I can leverage these techniques to really make it a more robust experience to the end user. So,
well, and speaking of the next item here, Chad, is 14.8.2.5, page content order and logical content order.
I was so happy to see this, Dax, because, traditionally PDF UA, I want to put this in a delicate way, but traditionally PDF UA overlooked the reading order of a PDF. And we've talked about this, Dax, multiple times on the podcast about the fact that there are two orders in a PDF, right? We have the tag order, which we could argue is the most important, but then there is also a reading order. And WCAG has always clearly said that your PDF needs to be read by all technologies.
Right. Current and future. Yep.
Current and future technologies. And as you and I have spoken about before, and we don't have to name names, but there are products out there who leverage the reading order instead of the tag order as the content order in a document. And that inherently is why it's important to set both orders when you are creating your PDFs as much as you can, right?
Yeah.
So 14.8.2.5 refers implicitly to two separate orders. One of them is called the page content order, and it says that shall be defined by the sequencing of graphics objects within a page's content stream. The logical content order, tag order, is the ordering for semantic purposes. And I think that's a big distinction too, Dax, that in the reading order, there is no semantic identification of objects. It's just numbered. It's just in order. Where in the tag structure is where you get the semantic position of those objects. This is a heading. This is a list. This is a figure, right? Where in the reading order, it's just
object.
Object. Yep.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And so if you want to look at this, there's 4 or 5 different paragraphs. It gives you a couple notes, talks about some of the extenuating content around logical and page content order. It definitely is good for you to talk about. In fact, there's an example, a couple examples of how logical order and page order might actually be be problematic or at odds with each other. So definitely go check that out. So this next one we're going to talk about is on page 770.
This one's interesting.
It's the nesting of standard structural elements, and that's 14.8.4.2, right? So this one talks about the parent-child relationships between standard structural elements and the namespace. So basically it talks about what can be nested where and how it all works together. And it even mentions the role map. And then it goes into document structure level types, right, Chad?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. And so there's a table here, table 364, which talks about the document, and then table 365 talks about grouping of structural level elements. It talks about the part, the section, the div, the aside, the non-struct, and we even were looking at one that's farther down under sub-block levels called the sub, and that's not a tag I was really familiar with until we started kind of looking at it. But so if you want to understand how these things relate to each other, and one of my favorite ones to talk about is the non-struct tag, because we see this a lot in automated workflows, or some companies choose to use the non-struct as their catch-all tag when they're remediating documents. And it says the non-struct is a grouping element having no inherent structural significance. It serves solely for grouping purposes. This type of element differs from a div in that it should not be interpreted or exported to other document formats. In other words, if you hit file save as PDF or save as HTML, it's not going to get translated to something else. Its descendants shall be processed normally, right? So basically, it's just kind of a catch-all generic tag that you can use when you don't really want to define it as anything. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Not a big fan of it, but definitely I can see where it has its purposes.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this before. I know I run into this a lot when I teach InDesign, because we often need to leverage the articles panel to control the tag order. Mm-hmm. And I get this question all the time. People are like, well, should I create a new article for each page? And my answer is, it's really a personal preference. Some people some people have an easier time navigating the tags tree when their content is kind of organized at the page level. It doesn't have to be, though, right? And, again, the non-struct, I've seen that used in the same way, where each page has a non-struct element and all the contents within there are relative to a particular page. Yeah. Again, it's personal preference. I mean, the benefit of that is for the remediator. Yes. There's no benefit to the end user because, as we talked before, container tags, which include non-struct, article, div, section, aside, right? They're never voiced by assistive technology. Their sole purpose is to structure it for the remediator.
Well, and aside is one of those ones that's a little frustrating because a lot of people want to use aside for a sidebar. Right? But there's no voicing of the fact that the user is going from the main content to a sidebar. So the designers get frustrated because they're like, how do I tell my listener, my user, that they're going from the main content to a sidebar if the aside is not voiced?
Well, and it's worth mentioning, Dax, that the aside tag is new in PDF 2.0. Right. And I mean, they basically took a page from HTML. I mean, that's where that originally came from. HTML5 introduced the aside tag. And that's an interesting discussion, Dax, maybe one for another podcast. But I think the aside tag would be one of those unique instances where I think the aside should be voiced.
Right.
Because
I agree.
It's being put in a semantic tag that has a specific meaning.
You should be able to give it a summary, right? Like a table summary.
Or a title. right? I don't know if that, yeah.
Well, but titles aren't read by screen readers. So I mean, if you gave it a summary, a caption requires adding something, right? You've got to add on page text. You got to hide that text. But if I could right click on a container, like an aside, and do like a table summary, right? That would then allow me to then just say sidebar content or whatever else. Your only way currently to be able to tell a user they're going into the sidebar is if your sidebar has a heading. They would then know, okay, I'm moving into this other heading structure, but they still won't know it's a sidebar. You'd have to apply maybe actual text or alt text. You know what you could do is most times a sidebar has a background. You could tag that background as with actual text. So now it wouldn't be voiced as alt text or say graphic, but it would just say whatever you put in the actual text field. And you could then call it sidebar and they would hear sidebar heading level 2 and then on it goes.
The funny thing I find about that is that every time I've heard somebody explain what an aside is, they say it's like a sidebar. So, I have to ask like why they didn't just call it sidebar. You know what I mean?
Well, in here it says that the aside can be a call out element, a sidebar, commentary accompanying an article, or background information for the next section of a textbook. So there's some examples.
Yep. So if you go to page 774, and that's section 14.8.4.5, this is a really good table. It's table 366, where they talk about block level structure types. Right. That is a question that we get asked a lot, Dax, right? People are like, well, what's the difference between a block level element and an inline level element? And to some degree, it comes with experience, right? It's hard. I don't want to tell you to like go memorize lists or anything like that. But the more you work in documents, the more you're able to kind of be like, oh yeah, this is a block level element, right? So like a paragraph is always a block level element, right? It's always a block level element's an element that kind of sits on its own, right? And a heading, another block level, like it's an element that will never be inside of another tag. Right.
Never should be inside.
It never should be. And as a matter of fact, like in the pack checker, you'll often get an error that says inappropriate use of an X structure element.
Right.
And that typically means that the tag is in an illegal position. Yep. Like a lot of times you'll have a paragraph inside of a paragraph. It says, whoa, that's no good. Right. I think with captions, P tags are not allowed to be in a caption tag. I think it's a caption.
I think we looked at that, and I think that there was, matter of fact,
that might be an error that PAC is giving that may not be totally correct. Or maybe I'm thinking note. I think I might be thinking note, Dax. In a note, I don't think you can have a P tag inside of a note.
Yeah. So the caption I'm looking, so here's a good use right here live while we're in the podcast. I did a search for caption, table 372, standard structure type caption. There's a whole entire table here that talks about how captions could be used. And it talks about for a list or a table, and the caption shall be the first or last structural element. It doesn't talk about what can be nested inside a caption, though, however. So you'd have to do some more digging, right? But this is how you use this document. So definitely, worth doing some more research.
For sure. Sure.
Well, Chad, we are out of time, buddy. I think that there's so much more that we could talk about within this document. I think we should do another podcast on this.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we didn't bore our listeners to death on this one. Like you and I geek out over this stuff, but I hope our listeners were not like falling asleep as we're talking about this stuff. But give us some feedback, guys. Let us know what you think, and that'll determine whether we do a follow-up.
Part two, right? Yeah. I mean, I love looking at all this stuff because here's the thing. Knowledge is power. And being able to understand when somebody says, how do I fill in the blank, whatever it is. I know most of the time confidently when I tell someone that here's how you do it, or here's why you need to do it. And if I don't know it, because we don't always know everything, I can come back to this document and find out. And when people always ask me, Dax, how do you know so much about accessibility? It's because I've lived and breathed this document for 3-4 years now. And I've read the majority of it, but I'm always finding something new and I'm always finding some other things. So I'm really glad to see that PDF 2 is now available for free. So go ahead and go to pdfa.org/sponsored-standard. Make sure you're not using Chrome because they got some issues going on there. They'll fix, I'm sure. And you'll be able to get your copy. And if you've got questions, where can they go, Chad?
If you have questions, head on over to the PDF Accessibility Facebook group where you can ask all of your questions and one of more than 3,000 people can respond to your question and hopefully provide you with a good answer.
We have 3,000 100. Let's see how many we have. We have 3,387 members, so almost 3,400. And I will tell you, I've looked at the stats. We're about 50% active members, meaning 1,500 of those people are actively posting and answering and looking. So there's not a bunch of lurkers. It's an active group.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you have any questions, and of course, you can always reach out to Dax or I via email, ping us on LinkedIn, and we'd be happy to hear what you have to say. Well, listen, everybody, I really appreciate all of you for tuning in today. And again, I hope you really enjoyed our discussion and hopefully you learned a few new things about, PDF UA 2 or PDF 2.0. And we also want to thank the North Idaho College and their upcoming Pave the Way to Global Accessibility Awareness Day, or PWGAD. Again, it's in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho on April 19th, 2023. And just remember, if you're looking for in-person or online training or struggling to establish an accessibility program within your organization, head on over to accessibilityunraveled.com to learn more. My name is Chad Chilius.
And my name is Dax Castro, where each week we unravel accessibility for you.
Thanks, guys.